morning. This morning, we'll be in a couple places, but we'll be first in 1 Kings chapter 10, if you want to open there, and then we'll end up in 2 Chronicles chapter 2, which is what was read for us. But this morning, we are taking another look. This is part of a series that we'll be doing. It's a pretty loosely connected series. All it is taking a look at faith, but specifically faith as we see it through people who are not already Christian or not a believer. In this case, we're under the Old Testament, and so it's someone who does not yet believe in God, or certainly in this case, not Jews. And yet, sometimes the best examples of faith that we can find are those who are almost at the edges of the truth, but aren't there fully yet, or have just recently attained to that. And you think in your own life maybe of a new Christian and sometimes the fire that they have versus someone who's been a Christian for a long time and maybe has let that fire die down a little bit. And so sometimes it's those right on the edge of believing in God that show the most faith. This morning we're going to take a look at two examples from the Old Testament. And the only real connection that they have is that they're from the same time period and that they're both friends of King Solomon. But we'll look at them in turn. But we'll start out with Solomon himself. Now, obviously, he's a believer anyway, but Solomon, at this point in history, really at any point in history, he's the greatest or second greatest king of Israel, along with his father David. He's the wisest man to ever live. Not just the wisest, but also the most knowledgeable. He could speak on any subject with real information behind him, but also had the wisdom to use that knowledge. He's also the richest individual probably up to this point in history. Maybe not the richest since then, but certainly one of the richest of all time. And we'll talk some about his wealth as we go through this. But he doesn't get to this point by himself. And he doesn't claim to either. But he has a network of people that he interacts with. And he has kind of a closer group that will help him in the projects that he's doing. And one of those people we'll talk about. But those who were close to him or those that were part of this network, sometimes they were allies in war, sometimes they were trade partners. But whatever relationship they had, they received probably more than Solomon did from the relationship because of the wealth that he had. But one of the things that they would get in return, some of them at least, is just a little bit of faith. And so on some scale, some grander scale than maybe us, this is kind of a story of sharing faith with coworkers. It's who do you influence that you just do business with? And are they seeing God in you? And so we'll take a look at these two. The first person is the Queen of Sheba. So we don't really know a whole lot about her, except for a couple passages in the Bible. But she is presumed to be from the kingdom of Sheba. Possibly this is the same Sheba that's mentioned in Genesis chapter 10 in the dividing up of nations. I think that's in verse 7. And it's probably in modern day Yemen, which has been in the news a little bit more, so maybe you have an idea of where that's at. But she has obvious power in her own right, and she's wealthy in her own right. But she's going to come to Solomon, and we'll talk about that in a second. The other person that we'll talk about is the king of Tyre, whose name is either Hiram or some translations put it as Huram with a U. And so it's one of those two. But Hiram is the king of what would be today Lebanon, what would be a little bit later on Phoenicia, but at this time it's the land of Tyre. And so he was also a great man of great wealth. One thing that stands out for him is that he had great wealth in part because of the great forest of Lebanon, which were the cedars of Lebanon, as well as acacia and other things, evidently, that they would use these trees either for decorative purposes, like would happen in the temple, or in the palace that David had built already and had interacted with Hiram up to this point, or also for shipbuilding. And so they were known for these things. They became very wealthy from these things. And so what we have are three people, Solomon, and two other very, very wealthy people that are still going to be impressed by the wealth of Solomon. Let's look at them in turn. So again, 1 Kings chapter 10, and we'll start with verse 1 here. It says, "Now when the queen of Sheba heard the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with hard questions. So she's heard about Solomon, and she wants to see it in person. That's understandable. It would be a multiple week journey probably, especially with as much as she's bringing with her, just to go to see this king. But she says, or it says of her, that she had heard not just of the fame of Solomon. That's one thing. But the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord. And so evidently, it's not just that Solomon's reputation has preceded him, but the name of God has come along with it. And evidently, people look to Solomon and to the whole nation of Israel now and say, there's something special that's happening there. In verse 2, she came to Jerusalem with a very great retinue or following or caravan, and it was of camels that bore spices, very much gold and precious stones. When she came to Solomon, she spoke with him about all that was in her heart. So Solomon answered her all her questions, and there was nothing so difficult for the king that he could not explain it to her. That statement by itself is impressive, because imagine you being the queen in that situation. You get to ask any question. It doesn't say what kind of questions she was asking. Were they questions about history? He could answer them. Questions about nature, about religion? He knows the answers. Questions about maybe your own personal issues in life and what you should do? He can answer that too. He has all knowledge and all wisdom as much as anyone had ever had on earth. And so he answers her anything that she wants to know. In verse 6, we'll skip down just a little bit. Verse 6, she responds to all of this. It says, "It was a true report which I heard in my own land about your words and your wisdom. However, I did not believe the words until I came and saw with my own eyes. And indeed, the half was not told me. Your wisdom and prosperity exceed the fame of which I heard." So she's impressed by the wisdom. She's also impressed by the prosperity, by both. Remember, though, this is a queen in her own right. This is a queen of a powerful nation, and yet she goes here and she says that she hasn't even heard the half of what she's seeing now. What does that tell you? That a queen and all of the presumed wisdom that she has, and certainly all the wealth that she has, it's nothing. It's nothing compared to what she's seeing now in the household of Solomon. In verse 8, she goes on farther. She says, "Happy or blessed are your men, and happy are these your servants who stand continually before you and hear your wisdom." So she's also, because of Solomon's wisdom, she's almost envious of those who get to spend all day there just to hear his words. I don't know if you have anyone that you would think of that in that way in life, but maybe you do. Maybe you think that there's someone that's so wise that you could just listen to them. And whatever they have to say, you think, how great would it be to just be able to hear and read the words that they're able to speak, whatever they may be on, whatever subject. In verse 9, she says, "Blessed be the Lord your God who delighted in you, setting you on the throne of Israel, because the Lord has loved Israel forever. Therefore he made you king, to do justice and righteousness." Now the second part of that's interesting by itself. She says that God has set you on the throne because he was pleased with the nation of Israel. That's true. In fact, it's probably truer than she knows, that God specifically chose Solomon, that he would be king out of all of David's sons, and that he would be the one to rule over Israel. And it's because God wanted it that way. So there's truth there, but go back to the first part of verse 9, because depending on your translation, it will, at the beginning, say, "Blessed be the Lord your God." Well, we've talked about this before, but when we see that written out in the Old Testament, and if you're reading from New King James and others, the word for Lord will be capitalized, as in each letter will be a capital letter. And when that is written out that way, it's standing in place of the word from Hebrew of Yahweh, which is the name of God. Not the title of God, but God's name that he gave for himself. That's not a name that the people of Sheba had. That's not a name of one of their gods. That's the name of the God of Israel. What does she say? She says, "Blessed be Yahweh, your God." Now, it's not as if Sheba doesn't have its own gods. It's not as if the parts of the Arabian Peninsula that she's from, they've got gods of their own. And so why not bless those gods? Well, because evidently there's something so special about the God of Solomon and the amount of wisdom that this God has been able to provide to this king and the amount of prosperity that this God has brought to this nation. It's obvious that this God is doing something special. And so again, she's really just interacting with him more on a business scale, but she sees and is impressed by his wisdom, his wealth, but it comes from God. And it does come from God, and Solomon recognizes that. Solomon doesn't hide that fact. He sends the name of God along with his prosperity here. In verse 10, it mentions some of what she brought. It says she gave the king 120 talents of gold, also spices in great quantity, and precious stones. There never again came such an abundance of spices as the queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. Today, you buy spices in the spice aisle of whatever store you're in. Back then, they were very, very hard to come by and only grew in certain parts of the world. The amount of gold here is something like $250 million worth of gold today, if you're just adding up the weight and then multiplying that out by how much the spot price of gold is today. In reality, even if it is about $250 million, the spices are probably worth a lot more than that. And who knows what the precious stones are worth as well. And so she brings all of this. Again, does that show you how wealthy she is? And yet she brings all this and says, what I've got's nothing. And I hadn't even heard half of how great this place was and how much there was here. How much your God has been doing for you. In verse 11, we'll use this verse as a sort of transition. It says, also the ships of Hiram, that would be the king of Tyre that we're about to talk about, brought gold from Ophir, or Ophir, depending on how you pronounce it. That kingdom, by the way, probably borders the kingdom of Sheba. They're both in that southern part of the Arabian Peninsula. And so that may be some of the reason that the Queen of Sheba is wealthy as well, because a lot of, in this case, great quantities of almond wood and precious stones were brought. But Ophir is referred to several times in the Old Testament as being the place of the finest gold that you could get. And so every year these ships would bring in more and more gold from this place. If you skip down to verse 14, it says the weight of gold came to Solomon yearly was 666 talents of gold. By the way, 666 is not always a negative number. It just happens to be a number here. But that amount of gold, we're probably talking $1.2, $1.4 billion a year. Not to mention the precious stones, not to mention the spices, not to mention the traveling merchants in verse 15, as well as tribute from the kings of Arabia. You get the idea. Solomon has more wealth being accumulated than any other person on earth ever had to this point. And it just keeps coming in, and even from other kings and queens. But part of this, a large part of Solomon's success here, as set up by David, is his relationship with King Hiram of Tyre. And so go back over to 2 Chronicles chapter 2, and we'll start with 11, but what happens before that, starting in verse 3, 2 Chronicles chapter 2, verse 3, Solomon sends a letter to Hiram. And in this letter, or maybe it's presented as a courier speaking the message, Solomon says several things, but essentially what he says is, you supplied my father when he wanted to build his palace, and I'm asking for your help now to build the temple of God. You'll remember that Solomon was supposed to build the temple, not David. And so David had prepared some, but Solomon's still going to need some more help in this. So he's asking for timber to build the temple itself, and he's asking for craftsmen to be sent as well. And this is actually an exchange that's going to be happening. You go down to verse 10. It says, indeed, I will give your servants, the woodsmen who cut timber, 20,000 cores of ground wheat, also of barley, of baths of wine, and baths of oil. The dry goods would be measured differently, but just to give you an idea of what we're talking about, that's about 1.2 million gallons of wine and oil. So the scale of all of this is kind of beyond our understanding because we don't deal in these sorts of numbers very often. But that's the request of Solomon. You help my father, help me now to build the temple of my God. So what's the response here? Hiram responds positively in verse 11, and he says, because the Lord loves his people, he made you king over them. Almost the same response as we got from the Queen of Sheba, again using the title of the Lord, that is Yahweh. And so Hiram is also familiar with the name of God through Solomon, because he's not going to know that name otherwise. He might know it from David before, but he's learned this certainly from the nation of Israel. He goes on in verse 12, though, to say, blessed be the Lord God of Israel, who made heaven and earth, for he has given King David a wise son endowed with prudence and understanding, who will build a temple for the Lord and a royal house for himself. A couple of things to think about here. Number one, Hiram, in praising the nation of Israel, does not praise David. He doesn't praise Solomon. He praises God. He really doesn't direct that praise. He says it's good that David had a wise son, and it's good that Solomon is ruling, but it's God that has shown the favor, and God should be blessed in response to this. But the most powerful statement here, obviously, is in verse 12, blessed be the Lord God of Israel, who made heaven and earth. Is that significant for someone who's not a Jew at this time to say that God, the God of the Old Testament that we think of today, the God of just the Jewish people, just that nation of Israel, that God made the heavens and the earth? Ultimately, the response is going to be one of favor from Hiram to Solomon. In verse 13, it says, and now I have sent a skillful man endowed with understanding, Hiram, which is pretty similar to Hiram, but is a different name here. But Hiram, my master craftsman, who also in the next verse happens to be a son of a woman from Dan, meaning that he's actually half Jewish to begin with. But anyway, Hiram is being sent. But notice that it's not, I'm sending Hiram the craftsman, my master craftsman. That means the king of Tyre thinks so much of Solomon that he's sending the person that does all of his personal work, whether that be in stone or in precious metals or gems or anything, because Hiram is skilled in all of those things, as you can find out if you keep reading. But he sends craftsmen, he sends his best, he sends the wood as much as he needs, he sends everything that Solomon needs because he recognizes what God is doing for Israel. Okay, those are the examples. What can we learn from the examples? Let's start with this. We said it before, but these people had their own gods. Now today, people have things that they idolize. They have things that are maybe belief systems for them outside of the Bible. But these people had their own gods, and multiple, plural gods. They had gods for a lot of different purposes most of the time. But when you start to look at this, then you say, well, they had the god Baal. Those of Tyre would have worshipped Baal, as well as Markot, Ekmun, Ashtoreth, Baalat. What about them? According to the king of Tyre, it's not them. They're not the ones that made the heavens and the earth. Actually, Baal is supposed to have made the heavens and the earth, so that's pretty significant too. But sometimes when we're interacting with people, what is required is that we provide for them, and it's God doing the work here, but that we provide for them an understanding that there is one God who is able to explain this universe, that there's one God that is true and worth believing in, that whatever their belief system is not a good enough explanation for it. And that's where Hiram has come to here. He says, okay, I have my gods that I've worshipped from my youth, and yet they don't explain this. But seeing Solomon and seeing the wealth, seeing the wisdom that God has given, I get it now. That God made heaven and earth. Second thing we can look at is that we should, through every interaction that we have, make God's name known. Because if Solomon, in all of his wisdom and his greatness and his wealth, if all he does is say, look what I have done, kind of like Nebuchadnezzar does before he gets turned into a beast of the field. If he says, look at me and what I've built up and all the good things that have come along to me, then God's name is not glorified. Then God's name is not praised. And so any part of my life that I start to take credit for, any part of my life that I forget to give God the glory in, who's going to hear his name? If I take his name out of it and say it's just me, God is not going to receive the glory that he's due. But what's interesting in this story, God's name was kind of already known in this area. Maybe not as Yahweh, but the God of Israel is referred to a lot. Why? Well, because he parted the Red Sea. Because he sent plagues on Egypt. Because he tore down the walls of Jericho. He was well known for those things. That's been a few hundred years now. And yet, why do people know the God of Israel now? Not the wonders that he did back then, but the wonders of Solomon, the success of Solomon, and all of it points right back to God. It doesn't have to be the miracles that he's performed. Sometimes it can just be the success that he gives. And so again, for us as individuals, we say, if I have success, where does that credit need to go so that others can see God? It all has to go back to him. So whatever I have done, God's name goes first in it, and then whatever credit may be left over, maybe you take a little bit of it, but God's name comes first every time. Another point worth making here is that faith comes by hearing. We know that. But at the same time, it wasn't just the hearing about what God had done for Solomon, but it was interacting with him that led these people to show real faith. So Solomon, they had heard about Solomon, but as the Queen of Sheba says, she hadn't heard the half of it until she went and saw in person. And so for us, the question would kind of be, if someone has heard about God already, and then they come into some kind of interaction with you, are they going to leave with a greater appreciation of God than they had beforehand? Are they going to look at your life and say, you know what, that God that I've heard about, the Bible that I've heard about all of these years, it's making a real difference that I can see in this person's life. And when I look at the trust that they have, when I look at the peace of mind that they have, maybe not the material success, but when I look at their life and their character, I can say, I've not even heard the half of how good it is to be a Christian and a servant of God. What we see for Solomon is that God's name preceded him. And so to kind of borrow from the normal phrase of someone's reputation preceding them, does God's reputation precede you? Or is it just your own reputation? Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad when our reputation precedes us before someone has met us, but does God's name go with it too? Do they want to hear, as the Queen of Sheba did, not just about our success, but also those things concerning the name of the Lord? The last thing we'll say is that Solomon, while he was making trade partners, while he was making allies in war, he also, to some extent, was making people who would become God-fearers, who would become believers to whatever extent that may be. We don't have a story. We don't have the rest of the story of Hiram. We don't have the rest of the story of the Queen of Sheba. We don't know what they did later in life. We don't know if they became converted to the God of the Bible. But we do know that Solomon had real influence on them. I guess we can say the same thing for ourselves. Whoever we come in contact with, do they know God better because they came in contact with us. We may not know the end of their story either, but we can know we could have influence on them if God's name goes before our name in everything that we do. This morning, hopefully, this has been a worthwhile study of a couple of characters that we may not always look at in the Old Testament, but they serve as an example of what it means to have faith. Not faith that grew up in the church, not just faith that has kind of been settled in its ways for a long time, but a new faith. A faith that comes through interacting with someone who has such an obvious level of success, but also an obvious love for God, that He's the one that's glorified through the whole process. This morning, if you're not a child of God, you can't have that influence on someone else. This morning, if you're not a child of God, that's a big enough problem by itself to take care of this morning. This morning, God extends His invitation to say, become a child of mine, become more obedient to me, serve me more than you have before. But this morning, if you have any need of the church, if you have a need to respond to God's invitation, we ask you come now as we stand, as we sing.